I wanted to talk very briefly about some of the, about one research strain that came out of the Epidemi Lab, out of the work on the history of epidemiology in the 20th century that I'm currently doing, which I think is quite interesting because it offers a lot of interesting perspectives on questions that are very pertinent both to the history of epidemiology as well as to the history of science at large, as well as to STS and the sociology of science. And I thought no better audience than this to bring this out in the kind of sketchy preliminary state it is. I also was absolutely delighted to be listed right after Bloor. That is, and at the end of it, I promise you it will be a short, quick, brief introduction, and then we have a few questions, and then we catch the last train before off-peak is over. And I'm also particularly delighted about that very heartful comment of David's that those who disavow causality are the enemy. And that is a very nice, think of this as a postscript on that sentence, a bit of a thinking about what that means and what the various angle of attack on this might be. So, talking today about the social contagion of social contagion. What am I talking about here? I think I need to do a bit of preliminary clarification and definition to make sure we're roughly talking about the same thing. As you will very quickly appreciate, there is no clear definition. There is a lot of vagueness around this phrase, and that's something that I think is quite interesting. You find carefully crafted, consensual definitions like these. This is the one that also is now taken from Wikipedia, but it's often kind of stated in similar ways in lots of the papers you find in social network theory and other places referring to social contagion simply as a value-free, as a moral-free a dynamic of distribution of ideas, thoughts, behaviors, emotions, or conditions that spread spontaneously through a group or network. You also find, and here this is one of the classic texts from psychology or social psychology, a little bit more, I would say a little bit more judgy tone associated with social contagion. There is an association here with the kind of processes that are on the other side of what we would usually consider those processes covered by thought and reason. So social contagion as a process that is associated with the absence of reason, the absence of thought, a kind of a suggestibility to those aspects that are traditionally seen to be on the other side of thought and reason, emotions as something that comes often here, attitudes, certain practices, routines, tics. There's a lot of research that goes into those kinds of things. That the yawn, I think, is an example that many might appreciate, things that can spread through crowds and societies in ways that are not quite as rational as other things might be. If we take these different definitions, and both of them often exist next to each other in this kind of a world of engagement with the idea of social contagion, it's a quite interesting phenomenon, I think, because on the one hand, it is used by many in the field, or by many in various different fields, as a tool of analysis, as a lens to look at certain processes and how they either historically or concurrently distribute through society or distribute through certain sections or populations, part of society, while at the same time it is used by other parts as a way of describing a matter of concern. Social contagion, when it happens, is something that usually is associated with aspects of social dynamics that are not quite under control, that are not quite contained, that are not quite understood, that are not quite intended, and therefore matters that need to be studied, that need to be better understood, and need to be contained if they are cause for reason. So this leads me to the second kind of question that I think is important to clarify. Why should we care about social contagion? Why should we worry about this? By and large, I think it's a fairly small section of social scientists, psychologists, and other researchers who engage with this matter, but over the last few years, I think many of you might have encountered that, is certainly something that has gained an enormous popularity. I sometimes wonder if we might want to bring the pandemic, COVID-19, into that fold, but that's a bit of a culturalistic argument that I'm not quite comfortable with, but there is certainly an enormous popularity that you can measure if you want. You can just look at the literature and look what happens over the last few years and how many times social contagion is referred to as a tool of analysis and a tool of, and as a matter of concern. But it's also moving into areas that are a little bit offside, the kind of more scientific, the more kind of neutral engagement with social contagion, bringing in more kind of question of how social contagion is beginning to become a very popular term and terminology in the cultural wars. A tool to describe, and on the one hand, we've seen this in the last few weeks, a tool to describe, for example, the uptick in neurodiverse diagnoses. That's a very popular claim there, to think about social diagnosis as social contagion as a way to explain the increasing diagnoses, in turn also making claims and making assumptions about the reasons and about the wrong reasons why people want these claims. And the other very popular front in which social contagion is has become the talking point for many of the online discussions, but also some of the offline discussions, is of course the cultural wars around LGBT in the widest sense, as in this horrible example by a horrible Ben Shapiro, but also in more concrete terms and in more defined terms. It's a phrase and an argument that has become a core part of the continued attacks on trans people and the delegitimization of trans identities in today's society. So all of this together, I think it's important to look at this, to understand what it means, to understand how it's used, and to understand what we can contribute, or what kind of like a historical look at social contagion could contribute to this. And the more I looked, the more fascinated I was from what I quickly came to describe as a kind of historical epidemiology of social contagion. It has an enormous distribution throughout the 20th century in enormously surprising corners of the scientific landscape. So my first encounter with this concept was in the beginnings of formal mathematical epidemiology, which I've been studying for the last few years. Here, again, very surprising to me, people like Ronald Ross and others in the early 20th century started to think about social contagion as an essential part in their attempt to formalize the spread of epidemics, here epidemics of infectious diseases. But by thinking about infection and contagion not just as something that happens to pathogens, they began to think about contagion and infection as principles that can be applied to everything. In turn, they positioned themselves and their field of mathematical epidemiology as a field that's not only responsible for bacteriology and in its applied forms in society, but also that's responsible to explain and engage with all the secondary, tertiary, and further on factors that impact on the dynamics of epidemics, of infectious diseases, through the behavior of people, through infectious assumptions that people make, by also generalizing these ideas of infection far beyond what epidemiology was used to do. So that was one point. But then looking further through literature, it's very quickly become clear that this is a history of a terminology that then begins to crisscross between medicine, sociology, it goes then into physics, it becomes formalized in physics in a very interesting way. From there it goes back into economics, becomes an important aspect of explaining certain irrational behaviors among banks and other stakeholders in economics. It moves into biology to explain some of the what's called the population dynamics of infectious diseases and to understand some of the ecological aspects of disease there. It's an aspect that finds its way into chemistry, where it kind of is used to understand and to interpret some of the assumptions about the distribution of masses that is then being folded back onto theories of society and demography. And there we find its way to go into anthropology, where it's used to understand some of the ways in which certain practices and cults are being practiced, and back from there into fields where it's more prominent until today, and that's mostly psychology or predominantly social psychology. But also, it makes its way into scientometrics. It's crucial for the development of the impact factor, and you can trace lineages from there all the way into literature in STIS. If you want to have a browse on these kind of things, Scholia, which is a tool that is sitting on top of the scientometric data that Wikipedia and Wikidata have amassed, has a nice dedicated topic on social contagion, where you can browse the different kind of meanings that this has assumed in different parts of the scholarly landscape. But of course, the history of social contagion goes far beyond. In many ways, the kind of the matters are entirely reversed. So we're sitting here looking back at the history of social contagion as one that kind of like adapted from and moved away from a history from an understanding of contagion associated with pathogens that move from one body to another body or behave in certain ways like this. But of course, contagion until the age of bacteriology was always understood to be something that was of much broader concern, of much broader attribution to the ways people behave in crowds. There is a rich history of contagion and what it meant before contagion was materialized into bacteria and viruses and objects that are transmissible. And that, I think, is the history that we, first of all, need to recover to understand better how social contagion develops this kind of eerie power in contemporary discourse. But it's also a history full of examples like the history of smallpox, where famously kind of the question of contagion was one that was understood to be driven by the question of sight. If you see someone with smallpox, you're more at risk to develop smallpox yourself, was an assumption, and particularly in the 18th century, that defined much of the understanding of contagion in the pre-bacteriological era. But then also, if we go to the age of bacteriology, what's interesting again is that social contagion is not, or the idea of contagion has never been consumed by bacteriology. It has never been identified with epidemiology or with infectious diseases. On the contrary, in the late 19th century, the entire European discourse was infused by a language of contagion. There was, on the one hand, a language that was trying to make sense of the increasing risk of nationalistic movement in the colonies. We find a lot of that language used there to delegitimize nationalistic resistance, the virus of nationalism, contagious ideas that are spreading among the natives in colonized countries, threatening the rationality of the European empire, is a kind of like set of arguments that Raza Kolb has recently very nicely put in a book. I think it's called Imperial Epidemiology or Epidemic Imperialism, one of the men. But at the same time, the language of moral contagion, the language of psychic epidemics, of crowd diseases that capture the mind of people is also a talking point that in the late 19th century becomes the main talking point to understand the risk of society for democracy, to understand how society itself constantly provides us with a realm of suspicion, with a realm of suspicious behaviors, suspicious dynamics, suspicious procedures that are threatening the very institution of democracy, and that's the liberal, individual, conscious, rational mind. And in that way, the idea of contagion, or this kind of dichotomy of contagion and the rational mind, is set up at that time, and perhaps most strongly defined by Gustave Le Bon, a French polymath, physician, who wrote the whole book, The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind, that is mistakenly cited until today as a kind of book that provides us with the full understanding of social contagion mechanisms. But what it was a pamphlet demonstrating or arguing that the crowd is to be mistrusted because the crowd is that which brings those elements of society that are weaker, those elements of society that are fallible, those elements of society that are suggestible, those elements of society that are not white, male, and upright, whatever he meant with that, are those formations that once they assemble as a crowd via the passage of contagion are a threat to the stability of democracy, a threat to the stability of Western society. And it's those kind of arguments and those kind of infusions, I think, of social contagion at that time that continue then to develop this into the political framework that we have until today. So in that way then, when the epidemiologists begin to think about contagion beyond just the transmission of infectious diseases, and this just one of the kind of like many examples in the work of Ronald Ross, where he talks about in the highlighted area here of the happening has no effect on the total number of the population, as in mild infectious diseases such as chickenpox, dengue, or party politics. So there is a thinking that is established here via a long-standing tradition of thinking through societal problems as problems of social contagion, that is then imported into what becomes a formalized epidemiology, what becomes a scientific methodology, a mathematical scientific methodology to then capture and engage with what in Ross and Hudson's mind was a theory of happenings, a kind of generalized theories of epidemic distribution. But it is here a kind of theory that then offers epidemiological reasoning, epidemiological and mathematical reasoning as a tool to not only understand the threat that infectious diseases pose to society, but also as a language and as a scientific lens with which also to understand every single social crisis that poses a threat to society, that poses a threat to the state, that poses a threat to what is considered the hegemonial order and the state. Exemplified, this then could be in one of the trajectories that it takes, that the thinking of this kind of, and the uptake of these kind of methodologies takes from there. This is a sample of the kind of applications of the same mathematical apparatus that Ronald Ross and his colleagues defined in the beginning of the 20th century to what then becomes the epidemiology of rumors and the epidemiology of ideas. These are particularly texts of the generalization of an epidemic theory. This is a 1964 text by Goffman and Neville in Nature, where they argue for the first time that it's not only rumors, it's not only those ideas, and this, I think, chimes a little bit with David Bloor's arguments. It's not only ideas, it's not only rumors and figments of imagination and ideas that circulate, but it is the very content of scientific ideas. It's science itself that behaves like a social contagion, that behaves like an infection. And we need to use these tools, we need to use these instruments to develop a science of science, to develop an idea, a system to measure how scientific ideas distribute and to understand what is happening in those. And this ends, or at least this kind of like trajectory, then ends in what Eugene Garfield of the Institute for Scientific Information captured in 1988 quite nicely, that in consequence, we need to argue that people are susceptible to certain ideas and resistant to others. Once an individual is infected with an idea, he may in turn, after some period of time, transmit it to others. Such a process can result in an intellectual epidemic. In this sense, then we at the Institute for Scientific Information could be called, on the one hand, students and vectors of research, and on the other hand, the epidemiologists of science. And so social contagion continues to have these like two sides of it that I think are really, really interesting to unpack, and I'm really, really interested to see what you make of that. But it's the two sides of it where on the one hand it is constantly brandished as this kind of instrument of a scientific inquiry that provides us with a lens to fully understand the transmission of ideas that are seemingly out of control and lacking a causal factor that structures their distribution or that allows us to make sense of their distribution, while on the other hand it is also always ready to be flipped into an instrument of delegitimization, mass pathologization of social phenomena, and therefore one that has a very explosive, venomous power to both provide us with a pseudo-scientific, objective discourse, while at the same time offering a substantial and often very consequential delegitimization of that which it concerns. Thanks for your attention after a long day.